Welcome to the Creator's Covenant, a modern exploration of timeless truths of faith. Centered on the Quran as the sole source, we examine sacred texts, history, and science to reveal humanity's purpose, our bond with the Creator, and our destiny beyond life. Discover divine wisdom and Quranic insights.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, it's interesting how often we accept historical narratives, especially the really ancient ones, religious ones, just because, well, they've been passed down forever.
It's just taken as read sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. So today, we're doing something a bit different. We're looking at some scriptural analysis that, honestly, it radically reinterprets some major figures and the whole ancient timeline.
That's right. We're diving into a specific methodology championed by Dr. Khaled Waleed. You can find his work on the Almighty Covenant YouTube channel. And his whole premise is quite revolutionary, really.
Which is?
Interpret the Quran only through the Quran. Strict internal consistency, linguistic structure, demanding that every single verse has to make sense on its own terms without leaning on external traditional scholarship, the Torah.
Right. And the mission here, based on the sources Dr. Waleed provides, is to unpack, three pretty radical claims that really overturn centuries of standard understanding.
Yeah, they're significant.
Okay, so first, the figure of Israel, ancestor of Bani Israel, completely independent prophet, not Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
Second, this prophet Israel, he committed a serious theological error, something called shirk or schism.
A very specific kind, yes.
And third, and this is maybe the most challenging one, that Israel and his people actually predate the creation of Adam.
It definitely requires a shift in perspective. But what's compelling, I think, is the sheer rigor of the method. It doesn't just dismiss tradition, but it says tradition can't contradict the clear internal logic within the Quranic text itself.
And separating Israel from Jacob, like Dr. Waleed does, that just completely resets the clock, doesn't it?
It forces a total reevaluation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're essentially looking at a completely different timeline for human and prophetic history.
Okay, let's start there then. Unpack that first step. If we're setting aside the traditional view, we need solid textual proof, right? Proof from within the Quran that Israel is distinct, separate from Jacob, separate from Abraham. Where do the sources find that anchor?
Well, the foundational piece of evidence comes from Surah Maryam, verse 58. This verse, it lists the sources of prophecy, and it uses these very distinct categories structurally.
How so?
It talks about prophets from the descendants of Adam, then from those we carried with Noah, and then, this is the key part, it clearly separates the descendants of Abraham, Duriya Ibrahim, from the descendants of Israel, Duriya Israel.
Ah, okay. So the structure itself is making a distinction.
Exactly. I mean, if Israel was just another name for Jacob, who was Abraham's grandson, well, why separate them?
Right. Jacob's descendants are automatically Abraham's descendants. It'd be redundant.
Precisely. So the internal logic, according to this methodology, says if the text lists them separately, they must be two distinct original ancestral lines for prophecy. Israel, therefore, has to be an independent figure, someone who lived sometime after Noah, definitely, but clearly distinct from Abraham's immediate line in this context.
Okay, I get the structural argument, but I can already hear the counter-argument, The traditional view often assumes that anyone significant living before the Torah was revealed to Moses. Well, they must be linked to Abraham, because he's the main figurehead from that pre-Torah era. How does this framework tackle that assumption about time?
Yeah, that's a common point.
Okay.
And it's addressed by looking closely at Surah Al-Imran, specifically verses 65 and 93. Verse 65 is pretty clear. It stresses that the Torah and the gospel came down after Abraham.
Okay, established fact.
Then verse 93 brings in this specific historical event. It says, all food was lawful for the children of Israel, except what Israel forbade upon himself before the Torah was sent down.
So the key phrase there is before the Torah. Israel did something before the Torah came.
Right, and the traditional view tends to say, well, if it's before the Torah, it must involve Abraham somehow.
Or someone directly in his line, like Jacob.
Exactly. But the methodology here argues that's a logical leap, kind of false equivalence. The time between Abraham and Moses wasn't short. We're talking centuries.
A long time, yeah.
Plenty of time for other significant figures, other prophets, other ancestors to exist. So the argument is simply that Israel is one of those figures. He existed in that long gap before the Torah, but after Abraham's main time, without needing to be Abraham or Jacob. The verse itself places him there. independently.
Okay, so the separation is established textually by structure and by placing him in that specific pre-Torah time frame distinct from Abraham.
Correct. He becomes this independent, original ancestor of a major prophetic line.
All right, this then leads us into some really complex territory. If Israel is separate, what does the Quran say about him? What was his defining act? Why is he mentioned in this specific context of forbidding food?
This is where it gets really interesting, and it all pivots back to that same verse, Al-Imran 93. All food was lawful for the children of Israel, except what Israel forbade upon himself before the Torah was sent down. Now, the standard reading often just takes that as a statement of fact, some historical background. But Dr. Waleed's internal reading proposes something different. It suggests this verse is actually recounting an accusation. It's relaying a claim made by the people of the book at the time, explaining why they thought certain dietary laws existed.
Hold on. So God isn't stating it as truth, but quoting their justification.
That's the interpretation, yes. And the proof offered is what comes immediately after. Bring forth the Torah and recite it, if you are truthful.
Ah, the challenge.
Exactly. According to the sources analyzing this, that challenge essentially proves their claim. The claim that Israel himself forbade the food is false. The dietary restrictions mentioned later in the Torah were actually imposed by God much later, and for different reasons, often as a consequence of their own actions.
Okay, so the claim about Israel is false according to the Torah challenge. But what matters for understanding Israel is the nature of that false claim itself. What exactly were they accusing him of doing?
The core of the accusation lies in the act itself, forbidding something, legislating on food, when God had made it lawful. Doing so without divine instruction or sanction. And this act of, self-legislation, this is interpreted within the sources as the fundamental definition of shirk.
Whoa, okay, shirk. That's a really strong term, usually associated with polytheism, like idol worship. How does forbidding food equate to shirk?
Well, in this framework, shirk is understood more broadly than just idol worship. It's about taking any partner with God, especially in areas of divine authority. And legislation, the right to declare halal and haram, lawful and unlawful, that's seen as belonging exclusively to God.
So if a person, even a prophet apparently, makes something unlawful off their own bat,
they've implicitly claimed a divine right. They've set themselves up essentially as a partner with God in the act of legislating. That, the framework argues, is the specific type of shirk attributed to Israel in this verse, this schism of unauthorized legislation.
That's a profound reframing of shirk, and this alleged act, this legislative overreach, sets him in stark contrast to Abraham.
Absolutely. The contrast is made incredibly sharp just a few verses earlier in Al-Imran 67. Abraham is explicitly described as Hanaf Musliman, a pure monotheist, submitting fully to God, and crucially, he was not of the polytheists, not of the mushrikeen.
So the implication is...
The implication textually is quite powerful.
Yeah.
While Abraham represents pure, unadulterated submission and monotheism, the ancestor of Bani Israel, this figure, Israel was, according to the accusation recounted, involved in this foundational schism, this unauthorized lawmaking. It kind of sets Israel up as a prototype, perhaps like the figure mentioned elsewhere, who was given signs but shed them, followed his own desires, and fell into error.
An error his descendants then had to contend with.
Exactly, an inherited tendency, perhaps.
Okay. We've established Israel as independent, linked to this early schism of self-legislation. Now we get to the really mind-bending part, the chronology. How does Dr. Waleed's methodology use the Quran's internal structure to argue that Israel and his lineage actually existed before Adam?
Right, this is where the timeline really gets stretched. It connects Israel's descendants not to Adam's line initially, but to a creation that existed before Adam. The starting point is that pivotal moment in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30. God announces, He's placing a Khalifa, a vice Greg and Adam on earth.
And the angels respond.
The angels respond with a question, or maybe a concern. Will you place upon it one who causes corruption therein and sheds blood?
Yeah, and traditionally that's often read as, the angels having some kind of foreknowledge, maybe prophecy about what humans would do later.
But the strict internal reading challenges that. It points out that according to numerous verses, angels do not possess knowledge of the unseen, the Geba. They only know what God reveals or what they observe.
Okay, so if they don't know the future,
then their warning about shedding blood and corruption can't be based on prophecy. It must be based on something they've already seen, empirical observation.
They must have already witnessed creatures on earth causing corruption and shedding blood before Adam.
Precisely. That's the logical conclusion if you hold strictly to the idea that angels don't know the Cabe. This implies a pre-Adamic population already existed and was known for violence and corruption.
Wow. Okay, so there was a creation before Adam that was problematic. How does this pre-Adamic group get linked specifically to Bani Israel?
The sources differentiate here between two terms used for human. There's Al-Insan, often translated as the human, sometimes linked to forgetfulness, or in this context, the earlier flawed creation seen in verses like Al-Ajar 26. Then there's Al-Bashar, the Adamic human, created later, fashioned, given the breath of the Spirit, and appointed as the Khalifa. Al-Insan represents that pre-Adamic corrupting prototype.
And the connection to Bani Israel comes through.
It comes through the law of homicide, laid out in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 30 to 33. This passage starts by recounting the very first murder among Adam's direct sons, Cain and Abel, though not named explicitly.
The first human-on-human killing in the Adamic line.
Right, but immediately after describing that event, verse 32 states, because of that meaning, because of that first murder, we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul.
Wait a second. So the law against murder decreed for the children of Israel is explicitly linked right there in the text as a consequence of the crime committed by Adam's son.
That's what the text says, yes.
But if we follow the traditional timeline, the children of Israel, descendants of Jacob, wouldn't exist for thousands of years after Cain and Abel. That chronological jump makes no sense.
It's textually jarring, isn't it?
Unless the children of Israel being addressed there are not Jacob's descendants.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed's framework proposes that the original recipients of this decree against homicide, prompted by the first Adamic murder, were the ancestors of Bani Israel, but understood as the descendants of that earlier violent Al-Insan model, the pre-Adamic people.
So God was laying down the law for them, the existing violent population, in response to the first manifestation of that same violence within the new Adamic line.
That's the argument. It implies Bani Israel, in their origin, belonged to that earlier creation, the ones the angels were already worried about. They were the original subjects of divine law, aimed at curbing bloodshed, proving they existed before Adam's lineage fully took root and became the primary focus.
Okay, let me try and synthesize this whole model, based purely on this internal textual reading from Dr. Waleed. Israel is an independent prophet, not Jacob. He's associated with an early foundational error shirk, specifically unauthorized legislation. And chronologically, he and his people belong to an earlier creation cycle, the Al-Insan, who were already on Earth, known for corruption and violence, before Adam, Al-Bashar, was created and appointed Khalifa.
That captures the essence of it, yes. It paints a picture of almost two distinct human experiments. One lineage, Al-Insan via Israel, rooted in these primal issues of violence and legislative overreach, and then the Adamic line, Al-Bashar, founded on submission, chosen for leadership, perhaps intended to correct or supersede the flaws of the first.
And the ongoing story in the Quran involving Bani Israel then becomes, what? An attempt to manage the legacy of that first experiment.
You could see it that way. The history of Bani Israel becomes the history of grappling with that inherited legacy, that ancient tendency towards schism and violence, the struggle to fully align with the pure submission represented by the Adamic covenant.
This has been, well, definitely a deep dive, a really challenging look at a methodology that forces you to bracket out centuries of interpretation and just follow the text's internal signals wherever they lead. The claims are huge.
They are. And just to recap the core findings from Dr. Khaled Waleed's Quran-only approach that we've discussed, Israel is argued to be a separate ancient prophet. He's linked to introducing the sin of self-legislation, a form of shirk. And perhaps most radically, he and his lineage belong to a creation sequence that predates Adam.
So, thinking about the implications, if the story of Bani Israel isn't just about Jacob's kids, but about the legacy of a fundamental pre-Adamic schism, the sin of making laws without God, what does that suggest about religious inheritance itself? Is the whole Quranic narrative, in a way, about bringing the descendants of that first flawed model, Al-Insan, back into the fold of pure submission established by Adam al-Bashar?
It certainly raises profound questions. And maybe a final thought for you to consider. If the original error of Israel, as argued here, was claiming legislative authority that belongs only to God, and if his descendants, in this view, inherited that struggle, could the ongoing global tension around who gets to make laws, divine law versus human law, be seen as just the modern echo of that truly ancient, maybe even pre-Adamic conflict?
That is definitely something to mull over, a lot to think about there. We really hope this exploration has given you plenty to research and consider in your own study of these complex texts and interpretations. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
تستطيع بإيمان